All right, everybody, are we ready to go? Is everybody excited? Is everybody feeling energetic in this wonderful moment in our nation's history? Okay, if we don't, we're going to try to. And tonight I am really honored and delighted to be with two amazing individuals, Guthrie and Skye, and each of them will have their own introduction. My name is Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush, and I am honored to serve as the president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance. And I'm really excited about tonight's panel and our opportunity to talk about Project 2025. We have two of the leading experts on this. Really, you could not have come to a more important and also like information-laden gathering. And they're really going to lay out some of the broad implications of Project 2025 for our society, for our laws, for the way we are intended, that they intend us to live together, and also, and that will be some of I expect some of Skye's emphasis. We also are very fortunate to have Guthrie, who is the senior director of policy and advocacy at Interfaith Alliance, who has really for the last year been looking at how this is impacting religion and how actually religion in some ways is the fuel and the backbone. I'm mixing all sorts of metaphors, but that it is really a part of what is meant by Project 2025 and some of what is implied. And so that will be a big part of what we do tonight. But we don't want that to be the only thing we do tonight, because we are coming together in a moment where it feels to me like we're, almost like at this pinnacle. And we could go this way and slide into Project 2025. But maybe if we could, bend the moral arc of the universe and imagine going forward in a promise 2025, in a forward-facing, imagining the future. And one of the things that's so important that in our democracy, religion and religious communities and the spiritual imagination is an important part of it. Now, what I would hasten to say, it's not the only part, and it's not even necessarily the most important part, but it's a crucial part of a whole. And I think those of us who are part of religious communities, those of us who are inspired ourselves and have been inspired by religious movements over the years of the American story, tonight we want to talk about how religion can not only be a negative, but also a positive. So I'm going to start out just with a few minutes of talking about maybe a vision for the future. And then, that will, it's what it might be possible if we take advantage of this moment. Then we're going to slip back and talk about what might happen if we don't do that, and if we adopt a Project 2025 mindset. And then we're going to, I'm going to respond a little bit to that after both Skye and Guthrie speak. And then we're going to invite a conversation and questions. So I'm just really excited. I'm going to just say a few words about what Promise 2025 is. Honestly, like where this came from is that we were, some of us were going to the DNC and we wanted to do something that wasn't just reacting. We wanted to do something that felt like we don't just want to respond to the framework that they've set out. We want to actually dig into our tradition. So we got some leaders from a wide range of religious organizations that work in the civic and democracy space. And we just passed the mic and said, what does Promise 2025 mean to you? And it was so inspiring. And so it's kind of become a frame for me of like, what could be? And this is really about recognizing religion has a role to play in the future. It has a role to play if we go down Project 2025. Religion has a role to play in creating a theocracy, something that where one small sliver of American religious tradition gets to dictate to everyone else what goes. But we also can imagine religious playing a role in developing a democracy where there's a positive interplay, but mostly a boundary between religion and government, but that we can be inspired, that it's an anti-authoritarian movement. We want to promise 2025 to me is about freedom. It's about, and it's not about like religious extremism. It's about the opportunity to learn and be educated rather than indoctrinated. So the idea is that we will show up for one another, that across the religious landscape, including atheists, humanists, agnostics, as well as Hindu, Jain, Sikhs, Muslims, Jewish, Christians, all of us there for one another, and recognizing that religion can be a bridge and not a bludgeon, that religion can be a cause for celebration, not discrimination, that religion can be a way to liberate one another and liberate our communities rather than subjugate. And it can be part of the building of a diverse democracy and not an exclusive grab for a theocracy. And we have to reclaim what religious freedom means. Religious freedom means to be able to be free from racial bigotry, from violence. Freedom of religion can mean being free to make choices about our own bodies. Religion can mean to love who we choose. Freedom of religion can mean to read what we want to read and read the real history of our country. It can mean freedom of religion can mean voting without intimidation and suppression. The vote is almost sacred, John Lewis said, and voting is a freedom of expression, freedom of religion. And so we have to recognize that, yes, freedom of religion is so important, but it doesn't mean you can do anything to anybody. It means that you have to respect our lives. Each of us have to respect our lives as we are with one another. And so the goal with Promise 2025 is to widen the circle of people who count in America and not restrict it, and make sure that our spaces are for all, not just for some, and that we together will make up a great American story of diversity as a richness and as a strength. And it's a time for us to take seriously that we the people, and also e pluribus unum, out of we the people together, we can become one where everyone is respected. This is not Pollyanna. This is something that can be helped, and we have made progress. It's possible to make progress, but it's not automatic. And so today we're going to talk a lot about the reality of what we're facing, but then also hopefully invite all of us into this spirit of possibility. And as we're on these last 2 weeks of this election and all the ideas that are floating around, we wanted to give a reality check on one hand, but also a possibility invitation on the other. So with that brief introduction into like kind of the broad framework of Promise 2025, I want to turn it back over to Guthrie and invite him to take the next step and move us forward.
I think actually Skye is going to go first about how Project 2025 threatens democracy, and then I'll follow Skye, since I think that is really understanding how Project 2025
sorry, that's right. That's exactly
checks and balances is so important. That's the first thing everyone should know about Project 2025. So I'm going to let Skye go first.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Guthrie, for having me. And it's great to see so many folks have joined. My name is Skye Perryman. I have the honor and pleasure of being on the board of the Interfaith Alliance. But in my day job, I lead an organization called Democracy Forward, and we are a national legal organization that was founded. We were founded in the wake of the 2016 election, where all of a sudden the fight for democracy was not the fight that the project that we've all been on to ensure that our democracy is as fully as inclusive as it needs to be moving us forward. But there was really a battle to just hold on to hard-earned gains. So it's what we saw in the prior administration. And so Democracy Forward is a group of lawyers, policy experts, and communicators that came together. We had to take the prior administration to court over 100 times. We won a lot to improve the lives of millions of people. And over the course of the past few years, we have been really embarking on an expansion of our work and an overall commitment to advancing democracy and disrupting extremism where it appears, which in many instances is in our state and local communities, and unfortunately is even in our courts and at our Supreme Court. And so Democracy Forward, we engage in litigation and legal activity, communications work all across the nation now. And of course, we are poised to confront whatever we may need to. In 2025, we of course hope that we have an opportunity to continue on the work of advancing democracy as opposed to having to be so concerned about having to hold on to our hard-earned gains. What I would love to do is just put this in a bit of context. So we'll go to a bit of a dark spot, and then I promise we'll get to a better spot in a minute. But I've been using this slide, which is from the Carnegie Institute, for some time in a few of these presentations to show you that in 2021, after January 6th, the United States was added to a list of global backsliding democracies. And so I just want us to reflect on that. And when you look at this slide, you will see that we are quite an outlier. We're the only country that is not in the global South or is not a former member of the Federation of the USSR at the time that is on this list. And we have remained on this list every year since. We can go to the next slide, Hannah. Last year, 13 presidential libraries, from President Hoover's library to President Obama's library, and this includes libraries like President Reagan's library and President Clinton's library, obviously political persuasions that don't agree on everything, all warned of the fragile state of US democracy. We have a Supreme Court that is reversing the rights of people, not protecting the rights of people right now. And we saw, of course, on January 6th, an attempt to disrupt the peaceful transition of presidential power. We continue to see election denialism, and we know that we will be facing those threats as we look to the next few weeks. These are things that happen in democracies that are backsliding. And so one of the pieces of our work is to look at what is happening in our country and to be able to look at it and not blink and understand that this extremism is here and that there are things that we can do to confront it and to build a better future. So Project 2025 arose in this context. And we can go to the next slide. But it is a project, you can go next, Hannah. It is a project that is quite unprecedented in all of the things that it proposes at once. When you actually start reading it, it's not as unprecedented. When you look at the individualized things, many of these are old ideas that have been tried and rejected by the American people, but that extremists continue to seek to try to win in some way in our society. But it is an unprecedented plan to eliminate checks and balances in our society and to take away rights and freedoms. And if you think that the US Supreme Court has reversed your rights, and they may have if you're part of half of the population, there are many more that are on the table when we look at Project 2025. Next slide, Hannah. Project 2025 was published in 2023. At Democracy Forward, we were already monitoring a number of these threats, and then Project 2025 made it a bit easier for us because many of the things that we knew would happen, that we saw happen in the prior administration, that we see in communities across the country, that we see these far-right groups seeking to do, appeared in the pages of Project 2025. And many of the proposals are things that a new presidential administration believes that it can do without the approval of Congress very swiftly. And so in my day job at Democracy Forward, we are very much looking for and planning and coordinating with a lot of groups that might have to be in an immediate pushback in sort of a legal stance if that were to come to pass. But I think the more important thing to understand, and we can go to the next slide, Hannah, is that Project 2025 is already here. We are seeing many of the ideas that we will go over in Project 2025 in states across the country, in communities that the Interfaith Alliance and many other organizations work in every day. We are seeing many of the theories in Project 2025, the plans, whether it's to reverse more reproductive rights, enforce Victorian era laws that would criminalize the transportation of medication, seek to continue to blur the lines between separation of church and state. All of those things, you can find those things on the dockets in our courtrooms across the country and in the Supreme Court and in our communities across the country. And so my challenge to all of us is to be able, as we move forward and learn a bit more about what's in this project, is to understand that for millions of people in this country, they are already living and facing the effects of Project 2025. And what could happen in a few weeks is that we may all end up having that project may become accelerated as a result of the way the presidential election goes, or we would have an opportunity to potentially slow it and turn the page. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But I do think it's important to ground this discussion, and Project 2025 is not something that could happen. It is something that is already happening. And our country is not it's in threat of backsliding. We are already backsliding, and really the work of our generation is to turn the tide, to propel forward, and to turn the page. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the policy elements of Project 2025 as a threat to democracy. And then I know that Guthrie will speak more to this, but I did want to alert you that Democracy Forward has put together a people's guide to Project 2025. It has gotten a lot of attention and been accessed by millions of Americans. You can go to our website at democracyforward.org to access the people's guide, where we also link to a range of other resources that organizations like the Interfaith Alliance and so many of our community partners are engaged in. So please, you don't have to read the whole 900 pages. We've done it for you, but it is important that we be able to look this extremism in the face and understand what it is and that it is here. Next slide. So who is behind Project 2025? And I know Guthrie will talk more about this. This is not the Heritage Foundation of 20 years ago, although I will remind you that the Heritage Foundation got its start by engaging in culture wars over books and ideas in our public schools decades ago. So it may not be so far from the Heritage Foundation of years ago, but it's certainly not the Heritage Foundation that many have had thought about. This is a very far right effort that has now been joined by over 100 organizations such as the Alliance for Defending Freedom, which I'm sure Guthrie will speak more about because it's a more Christian nationalist organization responsible for seeking to ban medication abortion and overturning Roe versus Wade, is one of the organizations behind this, as well as a number of the organizations that have been responsible for overturning racial equity protections and a range of other things, including organizations that have been engaged in election denialism and voter suppression. So if it seems extreme, it is. And if anyone tells you that you're overblowing the extremism, you are not. And you can just look at who is behind and what is behind Project 2025. The commonality of these organizations is that many of them are funded by the same highly coordinated network of funders that have been responsible for the reversals of our civil rights and that have been acting, frankly, ever since Brown versus Board of Education, and then later Roe versus Wade, and then after Obergefell and a number of other more progressive decisions to seek to move our laws backwards in the ways that they can. All right, next slide. It is an existential threat if it were all to be implemented at the same time. And I just listed a few of the issues. You can go to the People's Guide and learn more, but a few of the issues that are that are at stake in Project 2025. The project would seek to undermine the very basis of our federal system, our civil service, the notion we have individuals in this country, 2.2 million of them, that take an oath to the Constitution to serve the American people, but do not serve a president or just an ideological agenda, but serve, in fact, the American people. And it seeks to undermine and purge many civil service or recategorize them into political appointees. You don't have to wonder if this would happen. In fact, it was a policy that the former administration sought to implement in the latest days that the Biden administration was able to reverse. And so everything from undermining the basic sort of personnel of the federal government and how our laws get implemented and programs get implemented across the country, to really seeking to roll back reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, economic justice. It would have proposals that would make more than 4.3 million people ineligible for overtime pay and really affect working families' pocketbooks, to the elimination of Head Start, to the eradication in many ways of our public education system. There are a range of threats there. I want to be mindful of our time because I know that I'm splitting some time with Guthrie. I'll make a few comments about some of the broader policy pieces, but many of these are, and we can provide these resources to you, unfortunately, as you look at this extremism and say, well, gosh, how could that happen in the United States? Again, I challenge you to look, because many of these policies are already being implemented by these groups in fringe litigation where they're trying to get court orders across the country to see their regressive policies come to pass or to reverse progress, or in state legislatures and communities. But there are some things that we can do to turn the page and to confront this. So let's move on to the next slide. These are just some examples, and I think, Hannah, we can probably now get out of the slides, and I'll just say, yeah, enable discrimination. We can go through the issues, but I'll make a few comments on some of the other things we know about Project 2025. We also know that it is horribly unpopular. And all of the polling, there's no dispute. Right now, you're reading polls every day, and it's like, well, do I like this poll? Do I not like that? Guess what? Every single poll that you can pull from Project 2025 shows that there is no mandate for this extremism. And guess what? There will be no mandate for this extremism, regardless of who wins or becomes president after the presidential election. The American people have rejected this. It has caused, of course, political movements and candidates to try to distance themselves from this project. And so we've seen that there is power in calling out and in understanding and saying, let's really look at what these extreme groups are seeking to do. There is power in that it is really exposing in a lot of ways that there is no mandate for this type of behavior. What do we do to push back? I know Guthrie will go over that to some degree, but I will tell you that you should not feel powerless here. If you would have told the writers of the Heritage Foundation, many of whom, by the way, are seeking positions in all kinds of potential future administrations, that they would be shamed and have to actually distance themselves from Project 2025, they would not have believed you. This is actually a project and a type of document that the Heritage Foundation has put out in many presidential transitions, but this extremism is being so exposed for what it is. People are really activated. And so I will say that your voice matters, and having these conversations matter. And then there are a range of things that we need to confront. How is it that one political movement can wrap themselves around Project 2025? They probably aren't really worried about winning the majority of votes in this country because they're engaged in election denialism, in voter suppression, and in many of the things that we at Democracy Forward and the team at the Interfaith Alliance are working on the front lines to confront every day. And so we know it for what it is. We know who is behind it, and the context in which it's happening, and in a lot of the work that we can do to push back. I will have some more hopeful comments when we go into the discussion, but I think my role was to kind of paint this picture of how extreme it is. And so I hope I've done that, and I'm pleased to turn this back over to you, Guthrie.
Thank you, Skye. That was a great overview of Project 2025. And I just want to say it's an honor to present alongside you. To everyone watching, I had the experience of watching Skye testify before the House Oversight Committee in Congress for, I think, about 4 hours. She was the one minority witness called by Ranking Member Jamie Raskin, and was seated next to some of the architects of Project 2025, the author of the chapter on the Environmental Protection Agency, and 3 other people associated with Project 2025. And it was amazing. And Skye really defended democracy against these threats and against some of the most intense members of Congress. And it was also a sign that, you know, some political candidates are trying to back away from Project 2025. But as Representative Raskin said in that hearing, a lot of people are doubling down on their support of Project 2025. And so thank you for this partnership with Democracy Forward. As Skye said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of religion in Project 2025. Can you see my screen? Skye touched on some of this, but I'm starting in a similar vein with, we need to think more beyond just the Heritage Foundation. Project 2025 is a who's who of Christian nationalism. These are the legal advocacy groups and the kind of conservative religious right think tanks that have been shaping the Christian nationalist agenda, undermining our rights in the courts and trying to put forward this false myth that we're a Christian nation and that Christians should be privileged in law and policy. So as much as it is one organization that people are trying to distance themselves from, it really is a cross-movement project to coalesce around Project 2025. And Christian nationalism is a unifying permission structure that brings together a lot of different groups that have different policy aims. But as the head of Heritage Foundation writes in the opening to Project 2025, it's all couched as a effort to, stop the woke progressives from kicking God out of the public square. And it's all couched in this religious fervor language. And if authoritarianism comes to the United States, it will be done in the name of Christianity. These groups will be on the front lines of an authoritarian takeover of our democracy, cheering it on, saying you may not like some of the guts of the checks and balances, and some of these tactics may seem extreme, but we're doing it to restore God to the public square in their telling of the narrative. And so we have to be wise to the ways religion is operating as a way to justify many of these policies. One of the most alarming elements of Project 2025 is its doubting of the Respect for Marriage Act and the Obergefell decision that codified same-sex marriage. Project 2025 in the chapter on the Health and Human Services chapter talks about the Respect for Marriage Act has a non-religious definition of marriage. Of course, the Respect for Marriage Act is the law of the land. It is a law passed by the United States Congress, our secular Congress, that does not pass religious and non-religious laws. We pass laws in the United States that are secular. And the Project 2025 HHS author, Roger Severino, who is a far-right extremist Catholic, who did a lot of harm during the first Trump administration and would be unleashed to do even more should Project 2025 come into full force at the federal level, has really cast doubt on same-sex marriage being the law of the land and talks about maintaining a biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. In that same chapter, Severino cast doubts on the public health measures that were done in response to the COVID pandemic, talks about at what cost did the COVID restrictions have on saving souls by some of the restrictions that impacted houses of worship. Of course, the government should be interested in public health, not saving souls. That's the saving souls is the domain of religious institutions who best operate free from government interference and control. On LGBTQ rights, it talks about reversing all the work the Biden administration has done on LGBTQ equity. It also talks about restricting the application of Bostock that extended protections for LGBTQ people facing discrimination in the workplace, trying to counteract what they see as woke culture warriors, which is really just allowing everyone in the country to be equal under the law, no matter who you love or who you are, but portraying that as this ideological attack and really singling out trans people for specific scorn and discrimination in our country. I don't want, as we focus a lot on what Project 2025 is doing to harm LGBTQ rights, I just wanted to include also data showing that the vast majority of almost every religious group in this country supports non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. The Christian nationalist view as put into writing in Project 2025 is putting a very narrow, restrictive, far-right, extremist view of Christianity into law and policy that most American Christians and people of other faiths do not want across the board. You see all the different religious groups here, and then it shows from 2015 to 2021, the percentage increase for people who favor LGBTQ non-discrimination rights. So Project 2025 does not reflect where most religious Americans are on LGBTQ rights. Next, on reproductive rights. Project 2025 talks about pursue a robust agenda to protect the fundamental right to life, protect conscious rights, and uphold bodily integrity rooted in biological realities, not ideology. So in addition to attacking trans rights, it goes after abortion rights across the board, and would really put, Skye alluded to this, using Victorian era laws such as the Comstock Act to restrict abortion access across the country. And you're also hearing a lot during this election season and in our policy making about returning abortion rights to the state. And yet Project 2025 outlines a radical role for the US federal government to play in restricting access to abortion. It defines life as beginning from the moment of conception, which would have profound impacts for IVF and contraception, a backdoor nationwide abortion ban, reverse the approval of medication abortion, and limit emergency contraception. Again, this narrow view of Christian extremism and Christian nationalism does not reflect the views of most religious Americans. So here's more data to make that point. You see the different religious groups on the left-hand side of your screen. Strong majorities of many groups want Congress to pass a law preserving a right to abortion. Very few numbers want Congress should pass a national law banning abortion. So those numbers, even among white evangelical Protestants, is only 28%. And then the orange option is left to the states. But what Project 2025 would do is, take us down the road of federalizing anti-abortion measures, which is not the view that most religious Americans want. They're imposing a very narrow understanding on us. This is from the introduction, just an example of the culture war framing that is unhelpful and false, that the need to inject Christian nationalism is a response to somehow the left threatening tax-exempt status of churches and charities that reject woke progressivism. It's creating a persecution complex that then allows and facilitates a reaction to that through these restrictive policies. We also see a lot of problematic elements regarding education, which is a priority of ours at Interfaith Alliance. It talks about higher ed, prohibiting accrediting bodies from requiring policies conflicting with the religious mission or religious beliefs of the institution. Kind of across the board, if you say it's religious, you're allowed to do it if it harms LGBTQ rights and reproductive care. When it relates to religious liberty, we have expanding religious exemptions for faith-based service providers that are providing services such as foster care and adoption services, turning away same-sex couples, and really expanding. Now, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, did a lot to gut civil rights protections in the name of religious freedom, but this would go even further, and also using religious exemptions to limit access to reproductive health care. And so while expanding religious exemptions, Project 2025 also calls for directing more taxpayer money to religious organizations. So you'd both have fewer restrictions on these entities that receive taxpayer money to accomplish public goods. And then you also have them not having to follow the same rules. And I'm trying to make this point over and over again, so hopefully it's clear. These views are unpopular, and most Americans do not want this kind of expansion of Christian nationalism and pumping more religion into our society in a way that restricts rights for all Americans. Most Americans express support for separation of church and state using Pew Research Center uses a battery of different questions to come up with this scale. And this full-on embrace of Christian nationalism is a very small amount of the American population at large. but it is very well organized. It is very well funded. There are many groups making these arguments. They have a strong impact in the courts, in Congress. The Speaker of the House is an acolyte of David Barton, who is the father of teaching this false history that the United States was a Christian nation. And so while these views are very, and I'll stop my sharing of the screen now, but while these views are not popular and don't reflect the views of most religious Americans, they are having a huge impact, which is why we need to understand Project 2025 and organize in opposition to it. So I will turn it back over to you, Paul.
Well, I think I join the rest of the folks on the call in feeling, I think it's bracing, and this is a reality check, and it's and I think it's really important. The point that Skye makes is that this is not something that might happen. This is something that is happening in many parts of the country. I also want to just underscore what both of you have talked about, is that this is not about like how religion can play a productive role in society and inspiration. This is it is driven by a religious fervor that is held by a small minority of religious folks in America and folks in America in general. But of the religious people, it's a minority. And then when you include all of the increasingly secular society that we are a part of, it is really a small part of society that is attempting to impose its religious worldview on the rest of us. And that is understood to be a theocratic effort, and as opposed to a democratic. God, democratic, the people. So we, the people, are the ones who really have to make sure that we are able to invite our government to reflect our goals. And so I think the one thing that I really want to, well, Skye, I wonder if I'm going to take the privilege of asking one question of each of you, and then I'm going to move into, we're going to invite everyone to ask questions, and we're hoping to get to many questions today. But Skye, what's the legal strategy given, and I want to focus kind of on the religion and law aspect of this, because I think that's something that you hold. One of the things I love about Skye is that she's a deeply faithful, of many things I love about Skye, but she's a deeply faithful person who is has a brilliant legal mind, and so she is balancing these things. How do they fit together, and what is a productive role of religion in society? And so how do you imagine when you think about legally I don't want to use the word attacking, but that's okay. Confronting this vision from a legal framework, how does religion factor into your legal understanding of where we are?
Yes, well, I think there's a few things there, Paul. I mean, one is I just want to say we see in our work every day in courts across the country and in communities across the country that using the law to attack harmful and regressive and unlawful policies that are an affront to America's values remains a core tool. And that's the case even with the Supreme Court, and it's the case even with some of the regression that we've seen in the federal judiciary. So I just want to start by saying that at the same time that we say the courts are a backstop, they're a check on anti-democratic activity. Right now, they are also a front line, because many of these organizations that Guthrie highlighted behind Project 2025, these Christian nationalist ones, are equipped with lawyers that are seeking to misuse our courts in order to move our laws backwards. So what I can say is that at the federal level, if a new administration wanted to come in and implement many of these things, including the policies that Guthrie highlighted that are really an affront to religious liberty as well as to civil rights and to the well-being of people, there are legal remedies. Many of the policies that Guthrie highlighted are policies actually that Democracy Forward filed suit against in the prior administration and won. And some of that is using tools outside of our religious liberty laws. Some of that is using tools around how agencies are supposed to function, how the executive branch is supposed to function. But then in addition, it's important to understand that our jurisprudence has really regressed around the protection of separation of church and state. Hi, my son is saying hi to 100 people. To 100 people. Okay, hello. But our jurisprudence has really regressed around the separation of church and state. And so some of the arguments that one would hope to make and one would think about making may not be as available. And that's where we say Project 2025 is already alive and well at the Supreme Court. So what does that mean? Do you pack up your tools and go home? No. There are a range of things. One, as the law has continued to evolve, there is a real role for faith communities who may have some ability to, may have some ability to make change within their own communities under the laws. There is another important role for the voice of faith communities to say, not in our name. This is not the type of behavior that's appropriate even as deeply faithful people. And then, we actually have tools in our Constitution that our Constitution provides to enable the American people to hold our courts accountable to our values and to make sure that the courts are actually advancing justice. And so I would really encourage folks that are tuning in to think both about the frontline legal strategies. We need to go to court and we got to support that work and stand up and do that and support it. But then also about some of the legislative and policy strategies that may need to be pursued to pursue courts that really are doing justice. The opinion of the Supreme Court is a historic low right now, historically. I mean, it's very, very low, and that's a real problem for democracy. And there are ways to restore that legitimacy through our elected representatives enacting court reform, which of course President Biden is the second president in a century to call for. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you so much. And Guthrie, for you, I mean, you've been really on the front lines of confronting Christian nationalism in all its forms, including how it showed up in Project 2025. When you put your organizing cap on, especially as someone who's working on policy, how do you think that the broader interfaith community, I mean, we all, each tradition on its own has a role to play, but when we think about building power, both at the state level where this is happening, but also at the federal level, what's the invitation that we want to be a part of at Interfaith Alliance, and we want to build over these coming months and years so that there's really a way to advance, Promise 2025 as opposed to Project 2025, or at least to stop the enacting of Project 2025?
Sure, and I first went through Project 2025, which I don't think we mentioned on this call, is an over 900-page blueprint of policy proposals. And there are other elements to it too, like the recruiting policy to serve and actually implement Project 2025. And there's a playbook for how to implement it. And so when I first went through this book in August of 2023, it's now been over a year of talking at a very wonky level about policy debates, and it's gotten more and more attention in Congress, and it was talked about during the only presidential debate between Harris and Trump. And so it's had this, it's permeated the conversation, but I think also these discussions can get highly technical and divorced from how people live in their local communities. And I think really defending religious freedom is not going to be up to the Supreme Court or up to Congress. They have important roles to play, but it's up to everyone in their community. And so, for example, there was an effort in Texas, my home state, to replace public school counselors with religious chaplains. And not just any religious chaplain, there would be no accreditation for these chaplains except passing a background check. And so it was this awful effort pushed by Christian nationalist groups, and it passed the Texas legislature. But what the Texas legislature did is asked each school district in Texas to vote on whether or not to adopt a public school chaplain policy. And across the board, very conservative areas of the state rejected this policy. I was watching one school board. I watched a lot of the school board debates where you really see democracy in action in a school board, where you have parents and a lot of people getting involved. You know, their children's education is on the line, and people really feel a stake in the decisions. And I saw very conservative people, like one person who was Southern Baptist in Conroe, I think it was, talking about, you know, how would we pick the chaplains? And I want my children to learn about religion in church, not from the government. And so there was this, I think, a real uprising of religious freedom support and excitement in Texas across the board, knowing that, you know, chaplains play an important part in religious communities and in religious life. I know you were a chaplain, Paul, previously, and so chaplains are very important, but that's not the government's role. And people know that there's so many decisions in life that should be left up to you and your chaplain or your pastor or your imam or rabbi. You know, there's a whole religious life that we treasure and that flourishes best when it's kept away from the government picking and choosing. There's another effort to put up the 10 Commandments in public school classrooms. Which translation of the 10 Commandments? So all this forcing of religion through our public schools and through law and policy actually denigrates religion and denigrates our faith communities that I think are something really special to treasure. And so I think these conversations are not about 900-page policy blueprints and federal agencies, how they function. It's really about all of you in your local community saying, I want true religious freedom. I want to be free from the government picking and choosing which religion should be favored.
Yeah, and just another note on that, and that was such a great collaboration of groups. One of the things we did is we rallied religious groups to object to this. It wasn't necessarily, it wasn't just the secular, a legal strategy. It was actually, we got hundreds of chaplains to say, this is a terrible use of chaplaincy. This isn't the way it's used. So religious folks actually were the ones who stepped to the fore. And so that's a great way of imagining the organizing of religion to counteract this misuse of religion. I think that's really important. I want to open it up now. I mean, first of all, thank you both. And you're not going anywhere, because I think there's going to be questions that come in. I saw that Jacob Buller says, are there any historic precedents for initiatives similar to Project 2025? Can we learn from them for today's struggle? I wonder, Skye, does anything come to mind around that?
Well, I'll say a few things. I mean, one, and this is a talking point the Project 2025 people are using right now. So I just will answer this. I mean, the Heritage Foundation has, compiled various policy proposals in thinking about executive branches for some time. And so that is certainly just just to answer it on a very surface level. But I think that the more broad analogy for our time is really in the McCarthy era of American life, where there were serious policy proposals that really sought to vilify people groups, that sought to vilify the independence of our federal service. And that, of course, under that, when we know what the cultural and political environment was of the country at that time, it was a time of great change where there was a need to be moving forward on these progress-oriented and democracy-oriented issues. And there was a backlash that would disguise itself in so many different ways. And so I think that is one that's one sort of analogy that I would yield to. And look, when we think about that, it took people of great courage in that time to do the right thing and to stand up for their country in small ways, in larger ways, in their communities. This was not something that was just in the halls of Congress. It was about how you interacted at your school board meeting, how you, in your community. And so I will say the thing that gives me hope is that we have been in these points where, you know, democracy is the thing that you get only if you try to keep it, you know, only if you're willing to keep it. And we have been in these points where there have been very powerful forces seeking to move us back or to try to highlight the sort of more dark side of human nature. And this country has been able to pull through that on this journey towards true democracy and progress. And so, but we've got a lot of work to do, as I say, and we can't be complacent. But I think that might be a good modern analogy. The analogy for where the Supreme Court is, of course, is from the early 1900s, where there was a Supreme Court that struck down all types of policies and rights for people as people were mobilizing and organizing and seeking to protect the rights of workers, the rights of women, the rights of people. And that court too had very low approval ratings. And of course, the work of both lawyers and advocates in that time led to the progressive era and ultimately led to a change both in the courts and in our laws. So I think that there are these analogies, but it's very serious. And we're in an incredibly serious boiling point right now as the sort of even the global, those global statistics I started with showcase.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the McCarthy era is really interesting. It just brings to mind that famous have you no sense of decency at long last? Have you no sense of decency? And just the constant you know, attack. And I think the idea of standing up to it and staring it down, I think is going to be really, really important.
Right.
There's a question about Christian, it's called, I'll read the question. It's a good one. White Christian nationalism is not a Christian view. It is a racist, discriminatory, and harmful. Please explain exactly what Christian nationalism is. Guthrie, would you do that? I mean, you certainly could do a lecture on it, but if you can try to do like a concise definition, I think it would be very helpful.
Sure. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge the idea of the religion of Christianity, a faith, a 2,000-year-old faith that has been practiced for millennia across the world and is currently practiced by more than 2 billion people around the world. Christianity, this faith that is diverse and expressed in so many different ways. So it takes Christianity and nationalism, an idea of using turning patriotism and turning into something ugly that is used to create an us versus them, using nationalism to not to say a love of country and a love of our freedoms and our Constitution, but to use it against other people. And so it takes Christianity and nationalism and merges them into one ideology, that to be a good American, you need to be a good Christian. And to be a good Christian, you are a very certain type of Christian. And it harkens back to this false notion that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, a false notion. The United States broke from the tradition of an official state religion and created a unique experiment in human history of religious freedom for all. And by hearkening back to the founding era, it also implies that the people that held power at the founding era in the United States are who should hold power today. And that is why we name white Christian nationalism. Whenever I talk about Christian nationalism, I talk about white Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism and this Christian imagery and symbols often is providing this veneer on top of racism and white supremacy. So that's the definition of Christian nationalism, but I also want to address it's not a Christian view. I think there are Christians that espouse Christian nationalism. And as a Christian myself, a Baptist, you know, we have 3 Baptists on the call tonight. We have a obligation, I think, to also not just say they're not Christian, but to say, yes, Christians have, you know, work to do in our own communities, and we need to understand the role of Christian nationalism. And so I don't like to paint this, we're the good Christians and they're the bad Christians. I think as a Christian in a majority Christian nation, we are a majority Christian nation, we are not a Christian nation. There's a big difference between those two statements. You have an obligation to support religious freedom and reject Christian nationalism, and a responsibility to be an activist.
Yeah, I just want to mention one of Guthrie's role in his last position with Baptist Joint Committee was in helping to establish Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and that really important work that continues. And so And also take this moment to highlight Amanda Taylor's new book, which is Tyler's new book that's coming out tomorrow. What is the title exactly? It's like I love it because it's like how to confront Christian nationalism. It's very like how to.
It's even bolder than that, Paul. It comes out tomorrow. It's how to end Christian nationalism.
Okay.
Which I think we can do. I think the Christian nationalism is not popular. People do not want, most Christians do not want to declare this country a Christian nation and, enforce the theocracy. We can end Christian nationalism in our lifetime.
Yeah. Let's see. Project 2025 is alive in Florida. It was revised in 2023. We see a lot of the language from new Florida laws in Project 2025. I don't know if either of you are an expert in Florida law, but I know, Skye, you've been doing some work in Florida.
Yeah, we're fighting much of this in Florida. So yes, it's in Florida, and it's in Florida in even broader ways. Certainly the education agenda, which actually Project 2025 holds up Florida and Texas and other states that have very regressive policies and censorship policies as examples, but also in other milder ways, the way the civil service is treated in Florida, as well as some of the laws in Florida just seek to penalize businesses that represent more sustainable models or that are trying to do right by their workers or by the climate. So we see a number of those things. And I will just say, I want to compliment, Interfaith Alliance certainly has folks that are very active in Florida. And I will say in our work at Democracy Forward, where we represent parents right now in a litigation against the DeSantis administration around a range of sort of censorship issues, we really see in Florida the power that individuals can make, and both the power and the organizing power, and also in participating in litigation and making their voices heard and organizing in their community. And so watching on folks on the ground in Florida, including those we've seen through Interfaith Alliance, the communities we have the privilege of working with at Democracy Forward, has actually been quite just has been quite inspirational. And I think that there are some wins that have been had, even in this hard time in Florida, which of course you all that are on the call would, some of the guests on the call from Florida would be, are very also aware of. So that's what I would say there. But yes, I do think that's why we want to make sure people understand. I want to take all this outrage that everyone has about Project 2025. And if we end up on the other side of this presidential election with a president that's going to prioritize democracy, which is what we all hope, I want to take all this energy and everybody that's outraged about Project 2025. There's a lot of work that we can all be doing in communities across the country and in our courts to demand more and to defeat this extremism that is harming people across the country.
Yeah, thank you. We have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to read the last three questions and then invite both of you to kind of answer them. One is just a question of is the ACLU involved in all of this, and does Democracy Forward work alongside the ACLU? This is curious, Guthrie, what you might say to this. What would you say to mostly white progressive Christians who believe that the solution to the move towards theocracy is to disassociate themselves with religion in the public square, including clergy who are unsure of boundaries in politics? For example, interfaith work becomes despite of instead of because religion. And the last question is, well, I'm a Christian Baptist and Black. White Christian nationalism uses the Bible to maintain slavery. White Christian nationalists need to repent. Well, amen to that, 100%. It's, this is, I will say, like, just white Christian nationalism has been here since the founding of the country in one way or another. When the founders, like, for all of the great language, they really meant white Protestant landowner men. And so, like, there's always been this strain. It's been a constant, and there has been it's been a movement towards a more perfect union, but certainly it has always been there, and repentance is, I mean, it's still in order. So why don't you two just, Skye, maybe you
It's a
can.
very short question. I mean, with ACLU, I'll just say we do work alongside the ACLU in so many communities and nationally across the country. Our work at Democracy Forward is focused, yes, on individual rights as the ACLU's work is focused, but it is also focused on some of the broader structures around democracy that are not necessarily in the individual rights category, including the ability of the government to deliver programs and services for people, things like the independence of the civil service. And so we have a lot of overlap in our work and then some distinctions in our work, and they are wonderful colleagues, both at the local levels and at the national level. I'll let Guthrie answer the question around the progressive Christians. And then to echo you, Paul, I did not say this in my presentation, but I say it when I often talk about these issues. But after Brown versus Board of Education was decided, there was immediate violent efforts to undermine that civil rights victory. And the only other Supreme Court case that the country has experienced that type of reaction to was when the court decided Roe versus Wade. And the same groups that are behind seeking to and that were behind seeking to overturn Roe versus Wade are also funded by networks that will refuse to say that Brown was rightly decided. And so in the same way that we need to look at this extremism in Project 2025 and not blink, we need to look at what has been happening and understand that we really are in a fight for the soul of the country, as the president says, but we are really in a fight here to hold on to our gains as well as to move forward. And so I would echo the comments made about the really pervasive nature of white Christian nationalism, both obviously in earlier parts of the history that led to the justification or the attempted justification of the enslavement of people, as well as this continued whispering campaign where really people don't want to see racial progress in this country, and so mask it under so many other issues and seek to stoke these culture wars. And we know that the country can be better than that, and the vast majority of people want something better than that, but that is absolutely what's at stake. Guthrie, I know you really have your...
Guthrie, you have 1 minute.
Sure. I totally understand that for many people, the response to Christian nationalism and theocracy is to disassociate themselves from religion. I understand that impulse. People don't want to be associated with it. And yet I think there is a stronger impulse to contest what it means to be a Christian in public life, to be religious in public life, and to not cede that ground to the theocrats and Christian nationalists. I'll end with sharing a brief story about my trip to Florida last year, because Skye was talking about Florida. I went to Miami to the Trump Doral golf course and resort in Miami for the Reawaken America tour. And we went inside the tour and saw, this was Roger Stone and Michael Flynn and a who's who of far-right extremists. And it was a third COVID misinformation, a third election denialism, and a third revival. And so it was really hard to see. It was the most extreme rhetoric of Christian nationalism. And yet the next day, I met with 30 people that were wanting to get involved in fighting back at a local church right outside the Trump Doral resort. We were there with the Florida Council of Churches and other groups, national groups. A lot of people wanted to push back on Reawaken America. And so someone else in the chat asked, what's the first step in moving forward? Is make sure you're connected. If you're connected to Interfaith Alliance, join us, keep coming. We give you not just presentations that are educational like this, but tools to make a difference in your community. Don't just be dismayed and discouraged by what you see in Project 2025 or Reawaken America or what you see on the news. Be involved with a group of people in your local community making a difference, and hopefully you'll do that through Interfaith Alliance.
Well, and I will, as the president of Interfaith Alliance, I second that, but I also will say, sign up for the Democracy Forward newsletter, because it is filled with such important information. It's the one newsletter, aside from Interfaith Alliances, that I really read because it's valuable information. So please consider yourself part of, we are in this together. And that's the big idea, is that, Christian nationalism thrives in alienation, silos, and people distrusting one another. So the opportunity is for us to be with one another, learn from one another, and imagine this promise of 2025, this future together that we're building. Let me just say thank you so much to President of Democracy Forward, Skye Perryman, a wonderful, wonderful human being and national treasure. And likewise to Guthrie, Graves-Fitzsimmons, who has just been an incredible addition to the Interfaith Alliance staff. He's been with us 2 months, and we are rocking and rolling. We are going on a tour across America, a bus tour where we're talking about religious diversity, getting out the vote, and protecting our democracy. So thank you all so much for this evening. Thank you to Skye and Guthrie, and have a great night, everybody. And let's work for Promise 2025 and not Project 2025.